The NFL season is just a couple of days away, so in today's video, I want to try and predict the top 10 defenses heading into 2024. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be trying to predict the top 10 defenses for the 2024 season. And before I actually hop into my list, I have two honorable mentions. Those honorable mentions are going to be the Detroit Lions and the Las Vegas Raiders. I think both these defenses have a lot of talent and a lot of really good players, but ultimately speaking, I just can't buy into the defense as a whole quite yet because there's still a couple of holes these teams need to fix. With that being said though, I do think they're great defenses, they just don't quite crack my top 10. And lastly, before we hop into the video, if you go on to enjoy today's video, hit the like and subscribe button, but let's hop into the list. Coming in at number 10 is going to be the Houston Texans. Last year, the Houston Texans defense was actually somewhat decent. They didn't rank anywhere fantastic in any single stat, but they ranked relatively well throughout. Last year, they gave up 21.1 points per game, which was the 11th best in the league, and only gave up 2.3 touchdowns per game, which was 14th best in the league. But in the offseason, I think they had a really spectacular offseason that brought in a bunch of big name players, such as a Daniil Hunter, Azeez Al-Shaair, and Kamari Lassiter. And in my opinion, with these upgrades on the defense, I do believe this defense is going to be able to take a small step forward from where they were last year. I believe that last year this was maybe a top 15-ish defense, but I do believe this year they can move themselves up a couple spots by being somewhere in the top 10. I do believe offensively speaking, they're going to be able to put up a bunch of numbers. So potentially this could skewer a little bit of the defensive numbers if they get into a bunch of shootouts. But I don't really think that's going to happen. They have a defensive-minded head coach. I think they have so much good personnel defensively. I do believe that this is going to be at least a top 12 defense, if not top 10. Next up at number 9, I have the New England Patriots. Now I know this New England Patriots team is not that good at all really, but I think defensively speaking, they're actually kind of nice. Last year defensively, they gave up 21.5 points per game, which was the 14th best in the league, and only gave up 2.2 touchdowns per game, which was the 12th best in the league. And in this offseason, they basically ran back the same defense, plus a couple players and plus a couple new healthy players. And even though this defense doesn't really just shine bright with a bunch of big name players like a Micah or Nick Bosa or somebody like that, this is a defense in my opinion though that has a lot of really good players. They did just get rid of their number one pass rusher, which does potentially knock them down a tad bit, but I still believe this team is going to be really solid next year. Not offensively speaking, but defensively speaking. With a fully healthy Christian Gonzalez, with the improvements in the scheme and improvements with the overall roster, I do believe this defense can potentially be top 10. There's a lot of players on this defense that I do believe can take a big step forward. Guys like the aforementioned Christian Gonzalez, Kyle Duggar can continue to grow, Joshua Uche can continue to grow, Christian Barmore, Jawan Bentley, Jelani Tavai. All those guys I think have a bunch of potential that I think can still develop and grow into being even bigger pieces of this defense. With this team having such a poor offense, they're going to need their defense to be at least formidable and potentially top 10 for them to be any sort of relevant next year. Coming in at number 8 is going to be the Dallas Cowboys. Now, after this offseason, they did get rid of Dan Quinn and ultimately decided to go with Mike Zimmer as their new defensive coordinator, and I do believe that is going to be a slight upgrade for this defense. And that's no disrespect to Dan Quinn, but I do believe that his scheme and his time with the Dallas Cowboys had ultimately came to an end. We all know how that Packers game went. It was absolutely brutal. But regardless, this defense is absolutely stacked with so much potential and so much talent. And even though Deron Bland is going to be missing the first couple weeks of the season, I still don't think that's going to impact their overall defense all that much because I think they have some decent depth there. Last year, they gave up the 9th most points per game, only allowing 2.4 touchdowns per game, which was the 16th best. And they only gave up 306.1 yards per game, which was the 7th best in the NFL. And last year, I think you can make the case that this was a top 5-ish defense last year. I don't think it was top 5, but it was around that level. And with the offseason they had and with the improvements all around, I still believe this is going to be a top 10 defense. I actually do believe that Mike Zimmer's scheme can actually be a little bit of a upgrade over Dan Quinn's for this specific defense. Yes, there may be less turnovers, but I think the defense will be a little bit more aggressive in trying to go out there and get sacks and stopping the defense from getting a bunch of yards, kind of like what they've been doing the past couple years. However, coming in at number 7 is going to be the Chicago Bears. Last year, this defense did not rank very well amongst basically every single stat. They were 19th in points per game, 19th in touchdowns per game, and 12th in opponents' yards per game. But I do believe with the upgrades they made throughout the roster and with the offense actually looking somewhat competent this year, I do believe this defense could be top 10. With Montez Sweat coming in last year and proving that he's going to be one of those top edge rushers on a given team, I do believe they're going to be much better because the linebacking core is really good with guys like TJ Edwards, Tremaine Edmonds, and Jack Sanborn. And I think the secondary is also extremely underrated with guys like Jalen Johnson, Kyler Gordon, Jaquan Brisker, Kevin Byard, and Tyreek Stevenson. And as long as your front four guys can get some pressure on the defense without having to send a whole bunch of exotic blitzes, is, I easily think this could be a top 10 defense. I think a big reason why this defense last year wasn't all that impressive was mainly due to the fact that the offense was absolutely abysmal. But now that you do have Caleb Williams and all of the upgrades that you made on the defensive side of the ball, I do believe this is going to be a team that's going to be able to rely a little bit more on the offense, and the defense can rest a little bit more, which is in turn going to make this a much better defense as a whole. I would make the case that this is arguably the best defense in the entire NFC, but I don't think they're quite yet there. I think there's a couple teams that potentially have a slight advantage over them. With that all said though, let's now move on to number 6, the Pittsburgh Steelers. This is their one strength that they have been able to rely on the past couple years, and it's going to continue to in 2024. Last year they gave up on average 19.7 points per game, which was the 8th best in the league, only allowing 2 touchdowns per game, which was the 5th best in the NFL. The only thing that they did lack in was yards allowed per game, which was 21st best in the league, but I do believe there's a bit of something that you can say with that. Last year this was an absolutely abysmal offense. They ranked in the bottom half in basically every single statistic offensively, and a big reason why the Steelers were able to win a lot of games was off of the backs of their defense. Yes, they gave up a bunch of yards per game, but they sort of played that bend but don't break style of defense, and when you're out there so much throughout the game because your offense is absolutely abysmal, the other team's offense is going to be able to kind of get some yards on you, so it does make sense that they gave up a bunch of yards. But with that being said though, now that the offense looks, at least on paper, potentially a little bit better, with Russell Wilson being a clear upgrade over Kenny Pickett, then I do think this defense is going to be able to be even much better next year. With guys like Keanu Benton, Larry Ogunjobi, Cameron Hayward, TJ Watt, Patrick Queen, you guys know the rest. This is going to be a defense that's going to be really awesome next year, and as long as they can stay healthy with their big name players, I think this is going to be a defense that can easily be top 5 level. But coming in at number 5 is going to be the Kansas City Chiefs. This is kind of an unfair team. They are literally my number 1 offense and my number 5 defense, which is just absolutely ridiculous. And yes, I know they lost some pieces defensively, the big name guy being L'Jarius Sneed, but ultimately speaking, I'm really just not that worried about it. And that's no disrespect to L'Jarius Sneed. He's an absolutely incredible player, but just one player doesn't make a defense, so I'm really not that worried about it. Your front 7 is absolutely loaded with guys like George Karlaftis, Mike Donna, Chris Jones, Drew Tranquill, Nick Bolton, Leo Chanel, and your secondary is also still really good with Trent McDuffie, Justin Reed, and Joshua Williams. Am I a tad bit concerned about who's going to be able to replace L'Jarius Sneed? Yes, 1000% anyone would, but I'm really just not that worried about it. Last year, this team ranked 2nd in opponents' points per game, only giving up 17, and they also ranked 2nd in opponents' touchdowns per game with only allowing 1.9. They ranked 5th in opponents' yards per game, only giving up 298.9, and they basically rank in the top 5 or top 8 in basically every single statistic. This is an absolutely unfair team that is for some reason just so loaded with talent. How did we let this happen, guys? However, coming in at number 4 is going to be the Cleveland Browns. This is a team that is similar to a bunch of teams on this list where the defense had to kind of carry their offense throughout the year, but I will give some credit. I do think the Browns offense can actually be somewhat decent next year as long as Deshaun Watson is at least like a top 20 quarterback. But defensively speaking, last year they did give up a bunch of points. They gave up the 21st most points per game, allowing 2.8 touchdowns per game as well, but they ranked number 1 in opponents' yards per game. They also ranked number 1 in opponent 3rd down conversion rate and 4th down conversion rate as well, and they ranked 4th in opponents' yards per play. And this is a defense that was absolutely ambushed by injuries last year. So many of their star players had a bunch of injuries throughout the season. That's not just offensively, but also defensively. So now that this defense is going to be 100% healthy, I do believe they're going to be able to put up some incredible statistics this upcoming year. It's basically the exact same defense from last year, plus a couple of new additions like Devin Bush and Jordan Hicks and so on and so forth. But because this team has some continuity heading into this upcoming season, they were already one of the best defenses last year, and I think they're going to be even better, if not the exact same as they were last year. But let's go ahead and move on to my number 3 team, which is going to be the San Francisco 49ers. Last year, the Niners gave up 18.8 points per game, which was the 4th best in the league, 2.0 touchdowns per game, which was the 4th best in the league, and 319.7 yards per game, which was the 9th best in the NFL. And when you look at this defense, it is absolutely loaded with talent. They actually brought in a couple of new pieces to add to the defensive line with guys like Leonard Floyd, who I am absolutely excited to see what he could do for this defense. Now you get a couple players back from injury like Talanoa Hufanga and of course Dre Greenlaw. We shall see if those guys can step in from their injuries and play right away. I don't suspect that they will be 100% week 1, but they should be 100% hopefully by the end of the year. And you also have a couple new players like Bernardo Green, who's going to be getting some playing time this year, who I'm also extremely excited about. Whenever you have guys like Nick Bosa, Javon Hargrave, Dre Greenlaw, Fred Warner, Travarius Ward, and all these other star players defensively, you're going to have an absolutely awesome unit. And with this team having another year of continued continuity, I easily think this is going to be a top 5 defense yet again in 2024. Next up, let's talk about the Baltimore Ravens at number 2. Now, this one is a bit of a risky pick for me because this is a defense that's going through a lot of changes, both personnel and coaching wise. But I simply just cannot ignore how dominant they were last year. Even if they did lose a couple of players, the main pieces of this defense, your core guys that you're going to be relying on, are still there. Defensively, last year they gave up 16.2 points per game, only allowing 1.5 touchdowns per game, which was both the best in the NFL. They also ranked 4th in opponents' yards per game, 2nd in opponents' yards per play, 9th in opponents' third down conversion rate, and 2nd in opponents' red zone scoring percentage. And yeah, they ranked in the top 10 of damn near every single statistic. So I feel like it would be a little bit unfair of me for me to simply say they're not going to be a top 3-ish defense just because they lost guys like Patrick Queen and Geno Stone. Especially when you look at the defense and who they were able to replace them with. They still have Odafe Owe, they still have Roquan Smith, Kyle Van Noy, Marlon Humphrey, Kyle Hamilton, Brandon Stevens. So many great players on this defense, and I'm just not that concerned about them. Now, with that being said, though, this is a risky pick because of how much changes they did have in the coaching staff, especially with the defensive coordinator position, which could potentially knock them down a tad bit. But because I believe in their defensive coordinator and I believe in all of the personnel on this defense, I really have no issue saying they're going to be a top 10, if not top 5 defense in 2024. But at number 1, I'm going to give it to the New York Jets. Now, I know I might get a little bit of some feedback from that one saying that that's just not going to happen, but I think you got to hear me out. Last year, this was a team that averaged 15.8 points per game, which was the 29th best in the NFL. They also ranked 32nd in touchdowns per game and 31st in yards per play. So this was an offense that was absolutely abysmal at scoring and maintaining drives. But despite that, this was still a defense that ranked 10th in points per game, 9th in touchdowns allowed per game, and 2nd in yards per game. And they also ranked in top 10, if not top 5, in the majority of other stats defensively. And I look at this defense and I look at all of the great players on it, and I expect some progression from guys like Will McDonald and so many other players, and I just look at this defense and think that this is the most complete unit in the NFL. With the offense hopefully being able to stay healthy and hopefully going to be a competent unit, I don't see a world where this defense is not at least a top 5 unit. Barring any sort of setbacks or any sort of major injuries, I think this is going to be a great defense. They have the defensive-minded head coach. I think they have the personnel. I just really don't see a world where they're not top 10. But per usual, if you agree or disagree, let me know in the comment section below. And if you did enjoy, hit the like and subscribe button. And I love you guys. Peace.